The heat in Los Angeles that afternoon was heavy, almost pressing down on everything. For Thomas Mitchell, a retired Army veteran settling into a quiet chapter of life, it felt like any other ordinary day the city could offer. He'd just finished a simple lunch downtown with Mike, a friend he'd known since their days together at Fort Hood. Usually, after these lunches, Thomas kept his routine simple. Stop for gas, maybe grab a coffee, and head home to his calm apartment where the world moved at his pace. So, he pulled into a gas station on Sunset Boulevard, humming a tune under his breath that nobody else but him remembered. His car was the kind that blended in, much like the man himself, worn out but reliable. As Thomas stepped out, dressed in jeans and a faded t-shirt, nothing about him even hinted at his years of service. No medals, no military cap, not even the upright posture from his old photos. He was just another older man in the city, trying to get through the heat. But his instincts, shaped over decades, were quick to sense something off. There was a police cruiser moving slowly around the edge of the lot. Thomas saw the way two officers inside glanced at him, then continued watching as he started to pump gas. It wasn't just casual attention. The feeling was familiar, unwelcome and unmistakable. He'd seen it before in different parts of the world, where someone sizes you up before deciding what comes next. Trying to stay calm, Thomas did what people like him have always done. He moved steadily and didn't look up too much, so as not to draw further attention. Still, each second stretched out, and the weight of those stares worked under his skin. He could feel a knot forming in his stomach, the same anxious spark that taught him to keep one eye open even when the war was supposed to be over. In that moment, Thomas had no clue how quickly this ordinary day would spiral, or that soon he'd find himself at the center of something bigger than just a tense moment at a gas station. Inside the police car parked near the edge of the lot, Sergeants Matthew Collins and Aaron Green were in the middle of a quiet, tense conversation. Matthew, who had been with the force for over 20 years, exuded certainty and authority. He was the kind of officer used to giving directions and expecting no questions in return. Aaron, though, was a few years out of the academy. His uniform was crisp, his hair freshly cropped, and even if he tried to look tough, his eyes gave away his nerves. He could feel the heat too, not just from the day, but from sitting next to someone like Matthew, whose presence always filled a room, or, in this case, a car. They watched Thomas at the gas pump. Matthew gave Aaron a short nod. No words needed. "Let's go," he said, his hand drifting naturally toward his holster, thumb resting not far from his weapon. He didn't see it as intimidation. To him, it was just habit, maybe even assurance. For both of them, Aaron took a breath, his hand fidgeting with the edge of his belt as he tried to calm his racing thoughts. He'd been trained for confrontations, but these moments, turning suspicion into action, never felt as easy as the instructors said it would be. They stepped out, badges glinting in the bright sun. Their approach was straightforward and businesslike. No greeting, no small talk. Matthew's voice was firm, not raised, but cold enough to freeze the moment. "Sir, we need you to step away from your car. There's been a report of suspicious activity. Hands visible, please." Thomas caught off guard, tried to stay calm as he slowly set down the gas nozzle. He reached for his wallet and pulled out a battered military ID, explaining quietly that he was just headed home after lunch. But the officers barely looked at the card. Years of routine, of seeing danger where none existed, had taught them to move quickly past any explanations. Aaron shuffled awkwardly, not meeting Thomas's eyes, while Matthew stood close and watchful, radiating suspicion. The tension stretched out. The threat wasn't just the badge or the weapons at their waists, but something more invisible, the way judgment could sweep aside someone's truth, making a man invisible even as he stood in plain sight. As Thomas stood beside his car, doing his best to comply and keep calm under the officers' sharp gazes, A vibration buzzed from inside his rental. The phone, sitting on the center console, flashed with an incoming call. On the screen, he could see it was from the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C. He had been waiting all week for this call. It was about finalizing paperwork for new health benefits he desperately needed. But at that moment, surrounded by the tense skepticism of two armed officers, he knew any sudden move could go wrong. Every lesson he'd learned in the service about caution and protocol flickered through his mind. Very slowly, Thomas nodded to the phone, speaking first, so his intentions were clear. "I'm expecting an important call from the VA. My hands are visible, but I need to answer. May I put it on speaker so I don't have to reach for it?" His voice was steady, practical, but there was a tightness hidden at the edges. Though Matthew barely responded beyond a grunt, Aaron gave a stiff nod, his eyes darting between Thomas's hands and his eyes. Thomas carefully pressed the answer button with one finger, leaving the phone in its place so both officers saw everything. He did. "Hello, this is Thomas Mitchell," he said, hoping whoever was on the line could hear over the backdrop of barely contained tension. On the other end, a calm but formal voice identified herself as Ms. Jonathan, his caseworker at the Department of Veterans Affairs. From that small speaker, Washington snapped into the periphery of a Los Angeles gas station. Ms. Jonathan's first words were, "Mr. Mitchell, can you confirm your location before we proceed? I need to ensure you're safe to talk." Thomas suppressed the urge to laugh at the irony, his eyes still fixed on the officers. "I'm in Los Angeles, at a gas station," he replied, adding, "I have law enforcement with me." The call, meant to be routine, now carried the subtle alarm of a bureaucratic chain being tugged unexpectedly. Somewhere back in D.C., Mrs. Jonathan was already making notes, ready to escalate if something sounded amiss. Unseen to the officers, Thomas's small act of survival initiated a ripple far beyond that sun-drenched parking lot, showing how a simple call could turn personal tension into a matter with wider consequences. And as Thomas waited, maintaining eye contact with his watchers, he knew that sometimes what starts quietly can end up much bigger than anyone expects. Things escalated quickly, almost before Thomas could finish the sentence to Ms. Jonathan. Sergeant Matthews' patience finally broke, his voice cutting all softness from the air. "We're not here for phone calls," he barked, disregarding the old military ID, ignoring the reason for Thomas's calm. What mattered to Matthew was control, doing things the way he'd always learned, the way the streets had taught him. Without hesitating, he grabbed Thomas by the arm and forced him face first against the side of the rented blue sedan. The hum of city traffic faded in Thomas's mind, replaced by the sharp coldness of metal cuffs digging into his wrists. Thomas winced but clenched his jaw, trying not to let out a sound. Years of discipline helped him keep still, even as the phone slipped from the car and clattered to the pavement. The voice on speaker, distant yet desperate, cried out, "Mr. Mitchell! Thomas, are you all right?" But that voice was quickly muffled by the rough hands securing the cuffs and the somber realization creeping across the faces in the small crowd that was gathering behind the yellow pumps. Officer Aaron, watching this unfold, began to stumble over the protocol in his mind. He'd trained for difficult arrests, but now the routine steps felt all wrong. He hesitated, taking in the uncertain looks from a family filling up their minivan a few pumps over, from a cashier watching wide-eyed through the glass. Aaron's doubt was written all over his face. Even his hands shook a little as he moved to collect the fallen phone, the screen now dirty but still lit up with the connection to Washington. He heard the faint, tinny sound of Miss Jonathan's voice repeating Thomas's name, now tangled with static and confusion. Back in the capital, Miss Jonathan knew instantly something was wrong. She placed the call on hold and started dialing her own supervisor, knowing that any issue with a caller's safety, especially a veteran in direct contact, triggered an automatic response. Meanwhile, the commotion on the ground spread as more people became aware of what was happening. What started as a routine traffic stop now sent ripples far beyond the lot on Sunset Boulevard. Thomas, hands cuffed and dignity bruised, stood at the center of it all, feeling the sting of humiliation, while the invisible lines connecting Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. grew charged with urgent consequence. Inside the imposing headquarters of the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C., Vanessa Brooks sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of files and the gentle hum of copiers nearby. She was usually good at tuning out distractions, but the tense, muddled noise coming through Thomas Mitchell's still-connected call grabbed her full attention. At first, it sounded like background static, but then came sharper sounds, raised voices, the unmistakable clink of handcuffs, and a woman's distant calls for Thomas by name. Vanessa's gut twisted. She had handled hundreds of calls in her years on the job, some full of emotion, but this one felt urgent in a way she couldn't ignore. Without waiting, Vanessa leaned forward, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She pinged her immediate supervisor, Mark Donaldson, on their emergency line, speaking quickly but clearly. "Mark, we have a problem. Mitchell, Thomas." There was an incident during his appointment call. It sounded like he was confronted by police, location tracked to Sunset Boulevard, Los Angeles. "We need someone in local law enforcement looped in, now." Mark, long used to government red tape, recognized Vanessa's tone, meant this was not routine. He immediately pulled up the emergency manual and started calling the Los Angeles Police Department's Special Liaison Unit for Veterans. By then, a chain reaction had already started. Calls and messages spread out to state and city officials, each one marked urgent. In less than 10 minutes, a team inside D.C. had confirmed Thomas's exact location using his phone GPS and cross-referenced the time of the incident with calls from the public tip line that started pouring in as bystanders uploaded cell phone videos. Back at the gas station, the officers remained disturbingly quiet. Matthew stood rigid, staring straight ahead, while Aaron's hand hovered anxiously near the radio on his shoulder. Around them, the world felt like it was holding its breath. The gap between the rumbling bureaucracy and the tight silence on the street felt impossibly wide. Yet both sides braced for what would come from this moment. For Vanessa, now deeply invested in the unfolding situation, there was an unspoken understanding. She knew the wheels of Washington could grind slow or move like lightning when provoked. Today, it was the latter. Orders cut through the usual hesitance and nobody dared resist. The sense that something massive was coming sat heavy in the air, just waiting for the next move to arrive. Sitting in the back seat of the police car, Thomas Mitchell kept his mouth shut and his stare steady. He wasn't quiet out of defeat. Instead, silence was something he knew well. It was an old friend from years in uniform, a form of control when words could be twisted or used against him. Every muscle in his body stayed still, not because he wanted to cooperate with what was happening, but because too many years of hard lessons taught him that sometimes anything you said could make it worse. Complaints or protests would bounce around the inside of this car and likely land nowhere good. So Thomas watched the world go by through the glass, all the while listening to the officers argue outside in hushed voices. Matthew paced near the front of the car, checking his radio but hesitating every time his fingers brushed the button. Aaron stood by the rear door, glancing at Thomas and fidgeting with his badge. Their earlier confidence faded into uncertainty, each of them now thinking twice about how things had played out. The weight of their decision hung in the air and even nearby bystanders could feel it. The whole parking lot seemed charged with nervous energy. On the edge of the scene, Olivia Carter, a local college student, had watched everything unfold. As soon as Thomas was handcuffed, she started filming on her phone. She had a knack for capturing moments when something felt off in the city, and this was exactly the kind of thing people noticed. Olivia's video caught more than just the action. It picked up the way Thomas moved with dignity, even in cuffs, the awkward silence from the officers, and the murmurs from the gathering crowd. It didn't take long for Olivia's footage to make the rounds. She uploaded it to her social media accounts, where people all across Los Angeles picked up the story within minutes. The reactions were intense and immediate. Thousands of comments questioned the officer's actions. Others expressed outrage at how a veteran was being treated, and local news crews were tagged by people demanding accountability. Virtual crowds formed just as surely as the physical one at the gas station, with everyone wanting to know how and why this ordinary-looking man was being humiliated in broad daylight. The noise online was only getting louder, making it impossible for the officers, already plagued by their own doubts, to ignore that their actions were now public knowledge and up for scrutiny. Back at the Los Angeles Police Dispatch Center, the vibe shifted almost instantly as the phones started ringing off the hook. Normally, dispatchers dealt with a steady flow of calls about accidents, missing pets, and loud parties. In other words, business as usual. But these calls were different. They came from the highest levels of federal agencies and carried the unmistakable tone of people who were used to being taken seriously. The dispatcher on duty, Lucas Reed, felt his posture stiffen as he listened. To the voice of an official from the Department of Veterans Affairs, make it clear this was no ordinary inquiry. We are tracking an incident involving a Mr. Thomas Mitchell, a combat veteran. We've received credible reports that he may have been detained under questionable circumstances. Please confirm your personnel on site, and we expect a full update immediately, the official demanded. Lucas scribbled down notes, his pen shaking a little. In the background, he could hear supervisors murmuring among themselves, trying to piece together how an everyday stop at a gas station had become a matter of federal attention. Suddenly, everything moved much faster. Lucas relayed the incident number up the chain of command, and within minutes, word spread to captains and the police chief. Messages bounced from department to department at a speed that Lucas had never experienced in his years on the job. People he usually only saw in passing now rushed in and out of his office, talking in clipped, worried voices about transparency and accountability. No one wanted to be caught unprepared when the news broke, especially when it involved someone like Thomas, a decorated veteran with direct ties to powerful institutions in Washington. Meanwhile, the name Thomas Mitchell traveled quickly, rising through layers of local bureaucracy until it hit the desks of city officials and then even the mayor's office. What started as a seemingly straightforward stop was now a brewing storm, threatening the image and trust that the city's public officials worked so hard to project. It became clear to everyone involved that this was not just about whether one officer made a bad call. It was about what that call might say about the department as a whole. Now it felt as if the city itself was on trial, racing to control the narrative before it spun completely out of their hands. As the commotion at the gas station reached its peak, the arrival of several agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation changed everything in an instant. The dark SUVs pulled up one after another, engines still humming as polished shoes hit the pavement. The agents, led by Special Agent Linda Foster, wasted no time showing their badges to the officers on scene. Their presence alone radiated an authority that clearly towered over any local police insignia, and the way they spoke left no room for argument. Special Agent Foster approached the squad car with a calm confidence, holding out an official order. "We are taking custody of Mr. Thomas Mitchell," she said simply, not bothering with drawn-out explanations. It was not really a request, and everyone there knew it. Within moments, the back door of the police car swung open and Thomas was guided out, blinking against the glare of the setting sun. His wrists were red and marked from the cuffs, a silent testament to what he had just endured. Thomas's eyes met with Aaron Spencer as he stepped onto the sidewalk. For a second, both men hesitated. Aaron fumbled for words, but the situation called for silence. Matthew Hayes, standing behind Aaron, wore a thin mask of defiance, but the defeat in his eyes was plain as day. They watched as Thomas was checked for injuries by the federal agents, carefully pulling his sleeves up so everyone could see the damage that the handcuffs had done. Spectators, many still recording with their phones, caught every second of this reversal. Some whispered in disbelief while others were emboldened, shouting questions and demanding answers from the officers. Aaron and Matthew, suddenly aware that they were now the focus of dozens of cameras, exchanged glances, heavy with regret. Any effort to explain their actions now seemed pointless. Their voices, so commanding earlier, now faded to murmurs as they spoke quietly to each other, searching for some kind of defense that might make sense to anyone watching, or to themselves. For the crowd, the story was shifting right in front of them, and they made sure to capture every detail. Faces, movements, and even awkward silences were committed to memory and digital records. Thomas stood quietly in the protection of the federal agents, but he knew that, for the officers left behind, the weight of what had happened would not be easily shaken off. The moment Thomas Mitchell was finally released from the confines of the squad car, one of the FBI agents handed back his phone. He took a steady breath before glancing at the screen, only to discover a long list of missed calls and urgent messages. Some were from names he knew well, supervisors at the Department of Veterans Affairs, old contacts from his service days, and even a couple of politicians who, only days earlier, had treated him with open respect, some even admiration. Now, their silence on the voicemails was a message in itself, and it stung. It seemed that in just a few chaotic minutes, years of carefully built dignity and public regard could be stripped away, no matter what scars or records he carried from his service. Thomas pocketed the phone, but that bitter feeling wouldn't go away. He walked between two FBI agents, feeling eyes on him from all directions. The crowd had started to thin, but a few folks lingered, unsure whether to cheer, apologize, or just stare. He could tell from their whispers and the way they recorded every step that this story would stick around. But he was done with the spectacle for now. He looked straight at Special Agent Foster, his voice steady, almost practiced. "All I want is for everyone to know I complied the entire time. I did not raise my voice. I followed every instruction. Please make sure that is part of any report." Foster nodded, seeming to understand the reasoning behind his request. This was not Thomas showing weakness or looking for pity. It was about making sure nobody had a chance to twist the narrative into something more convenient for themselves. He knew how easily stories got changed when they hit public forums or official paperwork. How quickly the reputation of someone like him could go from honored to suspect if even a single detail was skewed. As they moved toward a waiting agency vehicle, Thomas could already hear the low hum of more official business. Agents confirming times, locations, and witnesses, promising updates for higher-ups who now needed answers fast. He was exhausted and frustrated, but he knew this was the right call. He would not give anyone the chance to rewrite what happened in a way that might come back to haunt him or others in his position someday. For Thomas, what remained most important was that the truth was on record, as it truly unfolded. By the time Thomas Mitchell took a seat in the FBI's black sedan, the fallout from his ordeal was spreading far beyond that Los Angeles gas station. News of what had happened was ricocheting from the city's emergency operations all the way to state capitals, and before long, the federal level. Within a matter of hours, High-ranking officials were summoned to urgent meetings. Phones rang, non-stop, and every relevant agency found itself asked for statements and explanations. The media picked up Olivia Carter's video, and suddenly Thomas's story dominated every major headline and social media trend from coast to coast. Except now, Thomas's name wasn't being celebrated for anything he had accomplished in his military career. Instead, people recognized him for the humiliating incident he had endured on a simple errand in his own city, one where he had once been treated with courtesy by strangers and colleagues alike. All those years of building a reputation could not keep his name out of group chats, newsrooms, or cabinet meetings, and not for reasons he would have ever wished for. Officials from the police department, city council, and even the governor's office scrambled to offer explanations as pressure mounted. The most basic questions, when asked out loud, exposed serious gaps. Why had the officers skipped the simplest step of verifying Thomas's identification? Which protocols had fallen apart so badly, and who had been responsible for enforcing them in the first place? It did not take long for these queries to reveal uncomfortable answers. People up and down the chain of command found themselves repeating awkward apologies or sitting in silence while meeting rooms filled with tension. Across the country, debates grew heated on news programs, radio talk shows, and online forums. Some called for investigations into policing standards and civil rights, while others demanded resignations from those in charge. For Thomas, watching this unfold was bitter. He had always hoped the legacy he left would encourage trust in the very institutions now being questioned on his behalf. Inside those closed offices and government chambers, a new kind of fear crept in. It was no longer about one mistake or a single veteran being wronged. It was the realization that something much deeper and much more broken had been dragged out into the harsh daylight, and nobody, from local officials to federal agencies, could pretend it was just a fluke anymore. As the day moved on and the news outlets gathered steam, things outside the Los Angeles police headquarters took on a life of their own. Reporters arrived in droves, carrying cameras and microphones, pressing as close to the building as security would allow. Some tried to catch a glimpse through the blind-covered windows, while others angled for answers in the parking lot, ready to chase rumors or catch passing officials for a quote. The finely worded, stumbling statements from local police leadership did nothing to quiet the crowds outside, nor the greater public outrage that simmered online and on television screens across the nation. Inside the FBI vehicle, Thomas Mitchell observed the situation from a literal and emotional distance. He scrolled through headlines, watched footage from the gas station that seemed to play on endless repeat, and glanced at live streams from reporters gathered at the very department, where for years he'd dropped off paperwork or exchanged quick greetings with fellow officers. He did not need the running commentary from journalists to understand how widespread this had become. Each detail, each shaky explanation or official denial by city leaders seemed to add fuel to a fire that was never about him alone. Thomas chose his next steps carefully. Despite having every reason to demand revenge or public apologies, he did not add his voice to the loud debate. Instead, he relied on that practiced silence once again, only now it was more than just self-protection. The world was watching, carefully, reading between the lines, measuring how he would respond. He wanted recognition not because of medals or titles, but because of the simple truth that had been denied to him while he sat handcuffed at a gas station. The right to basic respect, to be treated as a human being no matter what he had accomplished or where he came from. His restraint did not go unnoticed. Commentators and activists online pointed out that Thomas was not giving press conferences or calling for mass protests. He let the facts speak for themselves. The ordeal inspired some of the toughest conversations, Los Angeles had seen in years, about what respect for others really meant, who got to decide who was worthy, and how easily even a decorated veteran's dignity could be stripped away. Through it all, Thomas continued to watch quietly, believing that the real victory was if the system itself learned to see the humanity in everyone, not just those with shiny resumes or uniforms. As the national outrage refused to settle down, official channels knew they could not just paper over the incident as another routine mistake. Lawmakers in Sacramento quickly announced the creation of a formal commission to examine what had happened with Thomas Mitchell. The committee brought together a mix of people: military officers, state officials, regular citizens, and legal experts. For once, it looked like the investigation would not be hidden behind closed doors or buried in legal jargon. Every step and every testimony was supposed to happen with a level of transparency that most people had never seen before in past government reviews. The usual explanation that tried to chalk everything up as a simple mistake in procedure just did not work anymore. Too many people were watching, and too many felt this was about something much deeper than just a single bad call at a gas station on a Saturday afternoon. In city council meetings, state hearings, and on countless talk shows, community leaders and ordinary folks all kept saying the same thing. This was not just about Thomas. If someone with his record, having served tours overseas, having helped build programs for other veterans, could be treated like this, then nobody was really safe from similar treatment. Everything shifted when a well-known senator from California took the floor in Congress and gave a speech that people talked about for days. Hannah Ramirez, who never shied away from controversy, came out swinging. She told the country that what happened to Thomas Mitchell should scare everyone, no matter where they lived or what uniform they wore. If it can happen to him, she said, it can happen to any one of us or to the people we love. It was clear and direct, and it caught fire on every channel. Hannah's words ramped up the pressure even more, pushing Thomas into the spotlight. He had never wanted to be the symbol of a national problem. His quiet approach had always been about encouraging people to look beyond the headlines and see the dignity in every person. But now, whether he liked it or not, his face and name became a rallying point for a much larger conversation about power, accountability, and what it really means to be seen and respected as a fellow American. The story had expanded well past him, but it kept coming back to that quiet insistence on simple human recognition. As the political storm kept building and the media churned out new pieces by the hour, the everyday lives of the people at the center of the story were unraveling quietly, away from cameras and social media. Matthew Hayes, the younger of the two officers involved, was hit hardest by the pressure. Each night found him lying awake, replaying the event in his mind and struggling with his own regrets. He had stood there, doing nothing when it would have mattered most, and now that gut-wrenching choice followed him home. Family dinners became awkward, with even his parents keeping their distance and his younger sister barely speaking to him. What little comfort he had left came from long walks late at night, where he tried to sort through the tangled mess of guilt and public shame. Aaron Spencer, the senior officer, faced it differently. Always the type to push forward, he doubled down on justifying his actions. Around the station, he kept telling anyone who would listen that he had followed protocol, making his decisions in good faith. He brushed aside talk of consequences, insisting that the world had gotten spun up over a misunderstanding. To Aaron, protecting his own reputation mattered most, and he held fast to the idea that he could steer the public narrative if only he explained himself enough times. But things shifted inside the police department too. Some on the force defended Aaron out of loyalty or shared frustration at the scrutiny. Others, though, grew uncomfortable with his stubborn attitude and the way he dismissed what Thomas Mitchell had suffered. Quiet conversations in the break room grew bolder, with colleagues questioning Aaron's aggressive style and their own role in allowing things to unfold as they had. The department's Internal Affairs Division soon stepped in, opening a formal investigation, and rumors of possible disciplinary action became impossible for Aaron to ignore. He felt more isolated than ever, and the shield he had relied on for years, his image as the reliable, commanding officer, now worked against him. Outside the department, everyone involved tried to keep moving through their daily routines, but anxiety and public attention made even simple tasks feel heavy. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would come of the investigation and what changes, if any, might follow. The sense of uncertainty touched everyone, especially those whose choices on that afternoon could not be taken back. Eventually, as pressure mounted, all the details came pouring into public view. The body camera footage, along with videos shot by bystanders with their cell phones, spread quickly on the internet. Every news station in Los Angeles started showing the same clear images. Thomas Mitchell standing calmly, holding out his veteran's ID card, speaking softly and making no move to threaten or resist. The officers' voices were loud and impatient, asking the same questions even as Thomas tried to answer. It was obvious now that all those early claims about disobedience and resisting arrest had no weight. Those excuses fell apart in the face of that plain and steady video evidence. People across the country watched and could see that what really happened was not just a mistake, but a moment where someone's dignity was dismissed for no good reason. With the truth so clear, city officials had little choice left. A week later, the department announced the suspension of both Matthew Hayes and Aaron Spencer while investigations continued. The news was read out in a dry press release, but by then the public had already made up its mind. Quiet, half-hearted apologies from the police chief or the officers themselves did not offer any real comfort. Most people saw those words as coming. Too late. They wanted more than just regret after the fact. Crowds started gathering outside the police station. Some people held signs calling for respect and change, while others carried pictures of loved ones who had lived through similar experiences. It was not just about Thomas, and everyone knew it. The demands from the protesters grew louder every day, asking for better training, clearer rules about when force could be used, and strong new policies to make sure nobody else had to deal with what Thomas went through. For Thomas, all of this was overwhelming and strange. He had never meant to become the face of a bigger fight, but there was no turning away from it now. Watching others stand up for decency and fairness, he realized the story was no longer about one man's bad afternoon. It was about what thousands of people had waited for: recognition, respect, and the hope that this time real changes might actually happen. Even with journalists constantly calling and television stations offering to fly him anywhere for interviews, Thomas Mitchell kept turning them all down. He knew that if he went on camera now, his words would just feed into the noise, and he did not want his story twisted for ratings or turned into more fuel for heated arguments. Instead, Thomas spent his days away from the spotlight, quietly making his way to the Veterans Hospital in West Los Angeles. The staff there knew him, but not because of the headlines or viral videos. They remembered him for the long hours. He had volunteered to help new veterans adjust, for speaking at group sessions about finding purpose after service, and for quietly checking in on folks who did not have family nearby. Walking down those halls, Thomas felt the steady comfort of being recognized for things that mattered, things that had nothing to do with the recent uproar. Inside those hospital walls, there were no reporters chasing quotes or people pointing fingers. The gratitude he saw in a patient's tired smile or an old friend's nod from the end of a hallway was enough for him to remember why he had chosen a life of service in the first place. It grounded him and made the outside chaos seem a little less personal. These moments were a reminder that real respect, the kind that lasted longer than a news cycle, was born out of showing up for others again and again. never expecting applause. Meanwhile, Los Angeles' city government found itself squeezed from all sides. The mayor, members of city council, and members of the police commission attended meeting after meeting, facing questions aired live on local television. They were asked, often by angry residents, how the department could allow something like this to happen, not just to Thomas, but to anyone. Council chambers filled up night after night with community members who had their own stories to tell, or their own questions about how city leaders intended to do better. Why was there so little training about how to handle situations like the one with Thomas? Why did officers seem so sure they were making the right call, even when the evidence later showed they were not? Bit by bit, those tough public conversations chipped away at old excuses, bringing hope for real changes that had long been overdue. The impact of what happened to Thomas Mitchell continued to spread far beyond City Hall and the police station. All over Los Angeles, people gathered wherever they could find space, in community centers, local libraries, high school gymnasiums, and even on church lawns. Veterans told their own stories about feeling invisible or singled out after coming home. Teachers and school counselors spoke on the importance of teaching respect and empathy to students, hoping things would be different for the next generation. Organizers passed out flyers and started petitions, inviting neighbors who had never met before to talk openly about what justice should look like. Activists who had been fighting these same battles for years felt a new sense of hope, encouraged that maybe this time the city was actually listening. The feeling in every room was the same. People were tired of empty apologies, and they wanted things to finally change. Whenever Thomas's name came up at these gatherings, it was as a symbol, not a celebrity. His quiet refusal to seek attention had only made his example stronger. People asked themselves what could be done to make the city safer and more fair, not just for veterans, but for everyone who might be treated as a mere suspect based on nothing more than a moment's suspicion. Even though Thomas himself did not show up to these meetings, his story hung in the air, a reminder of all the voices ignored for too long. At the same time, police accountability took a dramatic turn. The department's decision to release the full, unedited bodycam footage fueled an even deeper public anger. Unflinching, the video made thousands realize just how serious the problem really was. As people reviewed every second, they began to ask harder questions about behaviors that in the past might have been excused or kept quiet. It did not take long for old complaints against Aaron Spencer to resurface. Former colleagues and residents recalled past incidents, stories that had been whispered and then shelved by supervisors, uninterested in rocking the boat. Patterns previously invisible emerged, showing that what happened to Thomas was not an isolated slip, but the latest link in a long chain of systematic missteps. For the first time, it looked like change would need to go beyond punishing a few individuals. The city was being forced to think about what it would take to transform not just the actions of one officer or one department, but the deep habits and beliefs that ran through the entire system. The story of what happened to Thomas Mitchell spread far beyond Los Angeles, capturing attention all across California and then spilling over into other states. It was veterans, especially, who felt the strongest connection. From places as different as Phoenix, Houston, and Chicago, men and women who had served in the military started speaking out online and at local meetings. They shared memories of the awkward, sometimes painful shift from being respected in uniform to feeling forgotten or even suspected once they returned to civilian life. Social media filled up with the hashtag Seen and Heard, which came from an idea started by Kenneth Carter, a Navy veteran from Georgia. Kenneth pulled people together, saying the time had come to stop sweeping these stories under the rug. He wanted everyone, not just those who had served, but the public, politicians, and police, to hear how hard it was to be misunderstood and invisible, no matter how much you had already given. Soon, this movement caught on, gaining a real following. Veterans organizations reached out, offering to help organize town halls and listening sessions. People from every background showed up, wanting to learn what they could do differently. As word spread, other areas started to look at their own law enforcement policies. Small departments in places like Dallas and Denver began running workshops, in partnership with local vets and civil rights groups. These programs focused less on punishment and more on building trust, showing police recruits what it is like to return home after serving overseas, and how important empathy and clear communication are during tense moments. Donations started pouring in from both big companies and everyday folks who simply wanted to see things change for the better. Even though Thomas never tried to become the face of anything, his story was now everywhere. Journals used his image alongside pieces about criminal justice reform. At rallies, people waved posters painted with his name and a simple phrase, "Service deserves respect." For him, the attention was still uncomfortable. He continued his work quietly at the Veterans Hospital, away from the banners and speeches. But for thousands, his experience had lit a spark. It was a reminder that behind every uniform, whether worn today or hung up years ago, there was a person longing for the simple dignity of being heard and recognized as part of the community. Amid all the calls for change and loud public debates, life for Thomas Mitchell remained mostly quiet, tucked away from the spotlight. Then, one Thursday morning, as traffic buzzed outside his window, an envelope slipped through his mail slot caught his attention. He took a moment before opening it, not expecting anything other than the usual bills and flyers. What he found, though, was an official letter from the city asking him to take part in a disciplinary hearing that would decide the fates of officers Aaron Spencer and Matthew Hayes. It was not a courtroom summons or a routine request. It was an invitation to help steer how justice would be handled this time, and maybe set an example for how things could be done differently in the future. Sitting at his kitchen table, letter in hand, Thomas let the weight of it sink in. He was being asked to do more than speak his piece. He was being trusted to shape a process that would reach far past his own story. The day of the hearing came fast, and Thomas made his way into a downtown building he had only seen on television before. Inside, representatives from city government, community organizations, legal experts, and state officials sat around a wide circle, ready to listen, not only as authorities, but as people willing to learn. When it was time for Thomas to speak, he stood up and looked out at the faces waiting for his response. They wanted to know what kind of punishment or chance at redemption he thought was fair for Aaron, who had acted harshly, and for Matthew, who had failed to step in. He took a deep breath and answered honestly, without anger or hesitation. He made it clear he did not want to see anyone's life destroyed, but he also said he would not accept an easy way out for either man. Thomas talked about the difference between holding someone accountable and seeking revenge. He spoke about the need for change, not just in individuals, but in the system that allowed their actions to go unchecked. His words landed with a sense of gravity in that room. Everyone present could sense that something bigger than a single decision was happening. What was decided here, and the way Thomas framed his answer, might end up being the starting point for how the city and maybe others would address failures in their institutions going forward. The meeting felt different from everything that had come before, partly because there were no news crews or crowds with signs, just a small group gathered in a plain room, with the city skyline peeking through narrow windows. Thomas Mitchell sat at one end of the table, a water bottle in front of him that he rarely touched. On the other side sat Aaron Spencer and Matthew Hayes, looking both nervous and tired, stripped of their uniforms and any sense of authority. Matthew, the younger of the two, spoke first. His hands were shaking just a bit as he apologized. He admitted that he had stayed silent when he should have intervened and had let loyalty and fear get in the way of doing what was right. He said he regretted his inaction more than anything and that he could not go back and fix it, but he wanted Thomas to know he was truly sorry. Thomas listened, searching for a genuine sense of remorse and honesty that often gets lost behind scripted words or official statements. In Matthew's voice, he heard not only regret, but also the heavy weight of someone who would carry this mistake for a long time. Then Thomas turned to Aaron. This conversation felt heavier, almost brittle, because Aaron's actions were so deliberate, so forceful, and carried a streak of pride that was hard to overlook. Aaron tried to explain his decisions, saying he was just following protocol and doing what he thought was necessary, but Thomas cut through those justifications. He told Aaron that rules are meant to protect people, not to be used to excuse cruelty or pride. There was no room for hollow explanations, not after everything. That had come to light. What Thomas asked for surprised everyone, including the two officers. He said the system needed real, structural change, not just discipline handed out behind closed doors. But most importantly, Thomas insisted that Aaron and Matthew stand in front of their fellow officers and tell the whole story, including what they had done wrong and what they should have done differently. He wanted them to face their peers, accepting the embarrassment and discomfort, because that, he said, was the first step in breaking the culture of silence that kept mistakes hidden. Only by being honest in public, Thomas argued, could they hope to stop these patterns from repeating, and only then could trust begin to heal inside the department and the community around it. Months went by, and slowly but surely the whole city began to notice real changes taking shape inside the Los Angeles Police Department. There were fresh guidelines about how officers should interact with the public, and everyone in uniform had to go through new training sessions that made respect and clear communication the priority. Identification protocols were stricter now, and supervisors checked up more often to make sure no one was slipping back into old habits. These changes were not just empty promises made after a crisis. They grew directly out of the hearing where Thomas Mitchell had spoken up. Even though he rarely showed his face in these spaces, his influence hung thick in the air, challenging long-standing assumptions and making everyone stop and ask themselves whether they were judging fairly or just following old routines out of habit. That shift was most obvious during roll call and department meetings. Younger officers brought up Thomas's story when talking through difficult calls, making it clear they wanted to do things differently. Some of the older officers at first grumbled about new rules and forms, but even they could not deny things, felt safer and more honest around the station. In break rooms, people whispered less about hiding their mistakes and talked more about fixing them. For the first time in years, department supervisors invited guests from the community, veterans, teachers, even social workers, to join training sessions, hoping to build bridges that would last. Eventually, after so much buzz and with the movement growing across California, Thomas decided to speak up one last time. He sat in his kitchen, in front of a simple camera, while the late afternoon sun poured across his table. His tone was calm. There was no trace of anger in his voice, only an honest, lived-in kind of pain. He said, "Respect should never be a prize that you win only after pain has taught you a lesson." With this, he reached for something bigger than himself, something anyone could understand. Real change happens not just from formal policy, but from brave voices daring to break the long silence, even if they never wanted to be a symbol. His words rippled through the city and far beyond, sowing seeds for a new way forward, where no one's story would be buried or ignored.